Thank you, listeners, for joining Mayer Brown's Global Financial Markets Initiative teleconference series. Today's call is titled Phase 6 of the Uncleared Margin Regulations, UMR, Key Considerations for Pension Funds. I'm Edmund Parker, and I'm Global Head of the firm's Derivatives and Structured Products practice. First, a couple of housekeeping items. As regular listeners will know, this call is being recorded. We will be emailing an audio link to all participants should you wish to listen to the teleconference again or indeed forward it to your colleagues. In addition, the recording will also be made available as a podcast on your preferred podcast platform. Since we will not have a Q&A session, please do send your questions regarding today's topic by email to gfm@mayerbrown.com and we'll come back to you promptly. This is the same email address on your invitation email. I'm delighted to be joined today by my Mayer Brown colleague, Edward Jewitt, and to welcome Shaun Murray, CEO of Margin Reform. Edward Jewitt's a partner in Mayer Brown's London office and coordinates our multidisciplinary pension finance group. He has comprehensive experience in the area of pensions law, including significant experience of issues of investment management and custody for pension schemes and fund managers, advice on implementation of market-leading LDI transactions and investments in swaps, hedge funds, private equity funds, and common investment funds. Shaun Murray is the CEO of Margin Reform. Shaun has over 30 years of international markets experience, which have been spent focused on enterprise-wide collateral management, credit risk funding, liquidity and strategy, working in Europe, Asia, America, and Australia at Tier 1 banking institutions. And with those brief introductions, we turn to the topic at hand. So, initial margin for uncleared derivatives has been a theme that has been going on for some time. It was first flagged over 10 years ago at the G20 conferences that pushed uncleared derivatives towards margining, and it was 2016 when we had the first requirements for posting initial margin brought into the market. Now, under the global margin rules, these were brought in Dodd-Frank in the United States and under the auspices of EMIR in Europe, which of course has now been replicated into the UK post-Brexit as part of UK EMIR. We had what was called the Phase 1 financial institutions. Now, these were the largest dealers and market makers of derivatives, those with over 3 trillion euros or dollars of outstanding notional derivatives, required to put in place arrangements for posting initial margin in relation to their uncleared derivatives. So these were the likes of Barclays, Banks of America, BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, and others, and there were 20 of them. So initial margin, as I'm sure most listeners will know, is the buffer element to posting collateral. So for pension funds, if you think back to 2016 and you put in place variation margin arrangements under EMIR and the documentation for doing that, that variation margin is designed to capture the closeout amount that would be required to be paid on any closeout of and is the master agreement with a counterparty. Initial margin is designed to capture an additional amount of collateral which could cover market shocks or similar that result in a greater amount of a closeout amount being required in distressed circumstances. So documentation was put in really very quickly following the release of the rules in 2016, and that was followed a year later by those counterparties that had over 2.25 trillion of outstanding notional derivatives. So Danske Bank, ING, Nordea, Santander, and two other institutions, they also had to put in place initial margin documentation and arrangements with all other captured counterparties. So that included the Phase 1 dealers that we just mentioned. We move forward to 2018, September 2018, and you can see the theme here. Those dealers and the first buy-side firm that had over $1.5 trillion of dollars or euros were now captured by the rules. So this caught the likes of BBVA, Lloyds, Brevin Howard as the first buy-side institution. Another 6 institutions were caught. 2019, brings the next phase, what was called phase 4, and we had about 70 banks, hedge funds, buy-side institutions with over $0.75 trillion or euros of outstanding notional derivatives. Now, there was much lobbying that went on in the market to postpone and reduce various requirements for what was known as the phase 5 institutions. And what we ended up with was not only a delay of 1 year for what were the phase 5 institutions, but a split with what was called the phase 6 institutions. So given the market was given a breather, and what was known as the phase 5 institutions, those with over 50 billion euros sterling or now pounds of outstanding notional derivatives, had to join this broader club of posting collateral in all of their ISDA arrangements with the institutions that had fallen into the earlier phases. Now, where do some of the pension funds get caught? Well, it's this new phase 6, which comes in 2021, and this means after 1st September this year, pension funds and other corporates and financial institutions with over $8 billion, euros or pounds of outstanding notional uncleared derivatives have joined this broader club of having to post initial margin in their counterparty pairings with all of their relationship as the master agreements with other phase 6 counterparties and those counterparties in phase 5, phase 4, phase 3, phase 2 and phase 1. So that means that there's a lot of captured relationships. Now, I've talked about outstanding notional derivatives. What does that mean? Well, what this is called the aggregate average notional amount of derivatives, which are measured during an observation period. Now, this observation period is March, April, and May of 2022. It includes all non-cleared derivatives transactions, including intra-group transactions, counting these only once, and it includes all entities within a group that consolidate into financial statements. So for pension funds, that would perhaps be a simpler calculation, but for some of the other counterparties in phase 6, that can be sort of quite a broader piece as you look across a group. So the difficulty with this is, particularly for pension funds that are around this cusp of 8 billion euros of aggregate average notional amount of derivatives outstanding, you're only going to know whether you definitely fall into the club of phase 6 counterparties once you pass these measurement points of this average you've got across March, April and May of 2022, and then all of your documentation and other arrangements need to be in place by 1st September 2022. Now, with some careful analysis, some careful preparation, it's probably possible for almost everybody to work this out, but there is work to be done. Now, why is this such a complicated process? Now, the first thing is when we talk to people, we say, well, they say to us, is it really that much more difficult than variation margin that the pension funds put in place in 2016? Well, the answer is yes, and it's much, much more complicated. And the reason for that is, with variation margin, the margin is transferred as a title transfer arrangement. So if you post £100 million of collateral to your counterparty, that is done as an outright transfer arrangement. So that's rather simple to do in terms of, at least with the standard documentation. What makes it more complicated with initial margin is initial margin has to be posted with your custodian, whom you have appointed, and the same is true for your counterparty. So that means there's a series of custody documentation that needs to be put in place. Initial margin can't be netted either. You have to use a third-party custodian, so this means a custody agreement has to be put in place, and I'll look at that in a little more detail in a moment. But also the assets which will be posted, security is going to be taken over those assets in favour of the counterparty under the law of where those assets are situated. So if you point Euroclear as your custodian, that means you have to enter into a security agreement under Belgian law. If Clearstream is appointed as the custodian, then assets and security needs to be taken under Luxembourg law. For Bank of New York Mellon, that could be under English law if the assets were held here. And the identity of the custodian affects what sort of standard ISDA collateral transfer agreement is used. We have a special version for Euroclear, a special version for Clearstream, special what's called a credit support deed if the assets are in the UK, and you have one of these usually, unless you have the same custodian appointed for both sides of an ISDA master agreement relationship, you're going to have a collateral transfer agreement for each side. So that could be, if you have appointed Euroclear, you need to have a Euroclear collateral transfer agreement governing that relationship. You also need to have, if your counterparty had appointed the Bank of New York Mellon, you would have a credit support deed put in place for that arrangement. You would have to have a custody agreement in place with your custodian. It will be necessary to have account control agreements which govern what circumstances the instructions are given to a custodian to release initial margin on a closeout of an ISDA master agreement. So there's a lot of information there, but what I was advising one client in phase 5, they said that they had 75 ISDA master agreements in place, and we did a calculation and we saw that actually that could result in 300 agreements having to be put in place for what was then the phase 5 of initial margin. Now, a lot of information here. We would really like to direct our listeners towards our Mayer Brown YouTube series on initial margin. We have 10 episodes in that, and we cover all aspects of initial margin in real detail, and we will send out a link to that with the materials for today's talk. Now, the various agreements that we've discussed, these are all available on the ISDA website. As I mentioned, there are a lot of them. It's not just looking at the particular type of collateral transfer agreement that's required. There's also, depending on which custodian is selected, as I say, you'll have different versions of standardized security agreements that will have to be put in place as well. So it's very important to have professional advisors that guide you through and analyze which types of documentation you need to put in place for each relationship. So with that overview, I'd like to turn to my colleague Edward Jewitt and ask which pension funds may be affected by the new rules in the UK and Europe. Edward, please tell us.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Well, many pension schemes use derivatives, and that's particularly for interest rate and inflation hedging. But it's only the larger UK and European pension schemes which will be caught by these new rules on initial margin. But whether you're caught will depend mainly, as Ed has already indicated, on the gross notional amount of uncleared over-the-counter derivatives that the pension scheme has. If it's more than 8 billion euros for European schemes, or £8 billion for UK schemes, the starting point is that you will be caught. But even if the 8 billion threshold is met, there is only a requirement to exchange initial margin once a 50 million posting threshold is reached. If a pension scheme is caught, then the next step is compliance action. And if you're an investment manager or an investment consultant that works with pension funds, then a lot of the work is likely to fall on you. I'm going to hand back now to Ed and Shaun, because they're going to explain in more detail what is needed by next September.
Edward, thanks very much for that. Let's take a look now at how pension funds should prepare if they've been captured by the rules and they're falling into phase 6. So the advice we always give to everybody is if you haven't started preparing for phase 6 and you're caught by phase 6, then you need to start right now in your preparations. September the 1st is of 2022 for compliance is a much tighter deadline than it initially seems. The first thing you need to do is line up who your counterparties are. So that means find out which ISDA master agreements have you got in place, which you are trading under, or you think you are going to be trading under. And the good news is that it's likely that most of the pension fund's counterparties are going to have been caught by the earlier phases, because they're likely to be the larger banks. And that means you are dealing with people who know what they're doing, who've been through phases before, who have teams that are looking at initial margin arrangements. So let's say a pension fund finds it's got 10 ISDA master agreements in place, and those are with banks that have been in earlier phases. So the first thing to do is to reach out to those counterparties. The next thing that you'll need to be really turning your mind to very quickly is appointing a custodian. So I mentioned a bit earlier on that initial margin has to be posted by the pension fund with a custodian, and the main custodians out there are the what's known as the tri-party custodians. These are Euroclear, Clearstream, and the Bank of New York Mellon. They offer a service where you post your collateral, and they can optimize which collateral is posted under the arrangements and the most optimal arrangement. The other custodians are called the third-party custodians, and under those arrangements, you as a pension fund select the collateral that you're going to post, and that's effectively the same as what you do under variation margin. And there are pros and cons to whom you select and who your existing relationships are with. But what you do need to do is on board with those custodians, pass KYC, and get your agreements signed up. Now, we're aware that the main custodians are imposing very tight deadlines of getting all of the documentation signed up by January or February of next year, and that's one of the first reasons why this is a very, very tight process. But a pension fund, as I mentioned, will also have to consider the custodian appointed by its counterparties, which again are likely to be those similar main custodians involved in the field. And so in order to be receiving the benefit of the collateral posted as initial margin, or which can be enforced, you also need to onboard with those other custodians. So again, this is why it's important. You need to reach out to your counterparty, say, well, who are your custodians, and onboard with them as well. Now, once you've established who the custodians are, you can start to establish, well, what documentation needs to be put in place. Is it a Euroclear CTA? Is it a Bank of New York Mellon credit support deed? Is it a Clearstream CTA for your collateral exchange agreement? And you need to line that up as well. Reach out to your counterparties. Now, the bank counterparties a pension fund face will normally provide the first drafts of the documentation. So that takes a weight off your mind. However, there are so many hundreds of counterparties caught by phase 6, it's very important to get the attention of your main trading banks to make sure that they deliver that documentation to you. It also is important to consider what are the main relationships you had, which are the ones that you really need to have in place for 1st of September next year. There is some relief in that this documentation does not need to be in place until the amount of initial margin that needs to be posted under the relationship has exceeded £50 million for UK pension schemes. So there may be some ramp up towards that. In fact, some of the relationships, this may never happen at all. That 50 million threshold may never be reached. So a lot of financial institutions will say, well, actually, what we'll do is we will monitor this agreement. Once you hit a 20 to 30 or 20 to 40 million amount of initial margin that would need to be posted, otherwise than through this exemption, at that point we need to move very quickly and get documentation in place. The danger of not getting these documents in place is that you will find that your banks will be unable to trade with you. So my last thought on the preparations there is just to really stress that this is a lot more complicated than variation margin, and it's so important to get started early. So now I'm going to turn a question back to Edward Jewitt and ask Edward, who's responsible for getting all of this done at the pension fund, and who needs to understand what?
Thanks, Ed. So in the UK, ultimate responsibility sits with the trustees of the pension fund. But in practice, they will look to their advisors to help them. Investment consultants will help check whether the 8 billion threshold is met, and investment managers, custodians, and lawyers will all help with the other compliance responsibilities.
Shaun Murray, what do you see as the key considerations for pension funds and managers for initial margin?
Thanks, Ed. So we've been working through UMR compliance for 7 or 8 years now, and Phase 6 is really bringing to bear some really interesting issues and challenges in that this is going to be the first phase where funds and pension funds are likely and potentially likely to have more than one investment manager who are servicing them through the same fund. So if we think about pension funds, they have an LDI fund, they may have a derivative aspect, interest rate hedging to that. They are potentially going to have to share the 50 million threshold that we've alluded to earlier in this conversation. So the threshold for initial margin before you have to exchange. Now, the challenge is if you're multi-managed, that 50 million threshold has to get shared amongst your managers. So in the instance that you've got 2 managers, you will be sharing that 50 million. You could split it down the middle, 25-25. You could choose to do any other split, 40-10, 50-0. It doesn't really make a difference. But what you do have to do is it means you have to understand as a pension fund or as a fund where your exposures are. Now, understanding your exposure comes back to understanding the first point we've talked about, understanding your ANA. So when you go through that self-disclosure process and you work with your dealers to say, right, what is my notion of outstanding derivatives, non-cleared, and you understand who you're trading with, then you need to start thinking about, okay, what does that actually mean for me going forwards? Because remember, this is not a legacy portfolio we are looking at forwards from the 1st of September. So what we advise clients to do is to actually spend some time looking at the trades they've historically executed to understand what the SIM or the initial margin number would be on that existing portfolio. And you may choose to look at a 3-month or a 6-month or a 1-year period, or potentially a whole portfolio of a period, to understand then who really is your prioritization clients. Where are you doing the most derivatives? Where are you executing the most derivatives? Who are you going to likely to utilize the most initial margin with going forward? Because that is going to help decide and drive the discussions internally at the fund with the trustees, with whoever it might be, to say, right, where do we want to allocate that threshold? Where are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck? And there are a couple of schools of thought about how you do that, which I'm not going to go into detail here, but that is one of the largest issues that we see. So we know that through ISDA, there has been talk of 800 clients who are coming into Phase 6 next year, 2022. Actually, what that means from a legal repapering perspective is you can see a multiple of 800 happening. If I am a single managed fund, I have one threshold, I have one lot of repapering. If I have a multi-managed fund, I have 2 lots of repapering, potentially, because I'm going to be sharing that threshold. So we're aware, having talked to some of the Phase 1 sell-side organisations, the banks, that they have got, in some cases, over 2,000 potential repaperings to go live by the 1st of September 2022, which is exponentially larger than anything we've seen before. So from that perspective, it really means that firms who are going through that process today of understanding their ANA calculation, starting to think about the client engagement and which dealers they want to interact with, which are on the priority list. This is all the types of things that should be getting done, we think, pre-Christmas in 2021. So come January 2022, you're ready to hit the ground running and start thinking about how you're going to get those legal agreements in place. Are you going to have a mix and match of different custodians, as you've alluded to, Ed, or are you going to be able to go down the route of maybe requesting your dealers meet you at your custodian of choice? And we know that the largest custodians for the first 5 phases may well do that, and the dealers may well do that as they now have multi-relationships. But it's really critical then that as you do that analysis and you get to the point of understanding as an organisation where you're at, that you start to understand what else comes with it. So if you are able to stay under the 50 million threshold, you're not going to exceed it, you're not likely to exchange collateral, that is all well and good, and you'll have a minimum viable product that you need to complete. If you're going to breach, it becomes a conversation then you move into the world of custodial onboarding, technology, how's the operational side of initial margin going to manifest itself in your operations department? What are you going to look like from an IM model perspective? So there's a whole host of different things that we think Phase 6 are going to have to start understanding quite quickly. And there's obviously a lot of information out in the market in and around the uncleared margin rules. But there is a huge amount to undertake to understand, not least if you think about this from an EU perspective. EU is one jurisdiction. We know that the majority, lots of dealers are from EU, US, Switzerland, UK, and they have all got slightly nuanced rules, slightly nuanced regulations. Understanding who you're trading with, where they're based, the jurisdictional challenges are going to be quite critical. The other thing I would talk about that I think is quite critical as well for the pension funds and for any other fund is the type of collateral that can be posted. So we know, looking at the statistics year on year, the variation margin is predominantly cash. We also know that for initial margin, it's predominantly non-cash. Now, in some instances, cash can be exchanged for initial margin, but in reality, it's not happening very often. So you are having to look at fixed income assets, equities, physical gold. In some instances, you can use corporate debt issued by corporate issuance to satisfy your IM obligations. But there's potential change to the pension funds, particularly where, if we think about this, the clearing exemption that still exists today and the reasons behind that, that actually initial margin in UMR in particular may become slightly easier for a pension fund to deal with than for clearing, where they don't have access necessarily to cash assets, or cash as an asset, to be able to post for its clearing portfolio, hence the exemption. So these are some of the things that we think are going to become most challenging for the Phase 6 pension funds particularly, but also for any other funds who are coming into Phase 6 who, as you said, Ed, they need to get started on the journey, start thinking about their compliance. If they haven't started thinking about it already, then getting through that self-disclosure, that ANA calculation, engaging with your dealers through your fund administrators or your investment managers, and getting kick-started on the legal arrangements are really crucial early next year. We think it's going to be a real squeeze come September the 1st, 2022, to get everybody through and over the line with the quite tight deadlines that the custodians have got in place.
Shaun, thank you. And with that, we end our talk today. Thank you very much to Edward Jewitt and Shaun Murray, and thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. A few brief reminders: you will receive an email with a link to the recording of today's call, and the recording will also be available as a podcast on your preferred podcast platform. We will send through to you a link to our Mayer Brown initial margin series, and we know we've covered a lot of information into today's call, but if you'd like to delve into any of the 10 episodes, some or all of them, we go into all of the points covered today in some real detail and with some great graphics as well. Lastly, as mentioned before, if you have any questions relating to today's content, please email them to gfm@mayerbrown.com. Thank you again for your participation. You may now disconnect.